There we go. We started recording again. All right, let me just do a brief introduction. My name is Ann Bennett. I'm the Executive Director of the Laurel Historical Society. And you are in for a treat tonight, the second time around. We are joined by a professional archaeologist and a professional trained chef. My background is in archaeology, and I've worked on many different field crews in my time, but I don't think I've ever come across that combination of archaeologist and trained chef. So Henry Ward is our speaker tonight. He is a professional archaeologist. He works at WSP. And again, he has a background in archaeology. So he's able to understand firsthand from his work in the field a lot of the tools, the equipment that he's recovering from the grounds, and then with his culinary knowledge is able to bring some of the history and the food and the life of the Native Americans and Indigenous populations to life through their food and highlighting their heritage and culture. So I want to welcome our speaker, Henry Ward. I just want to also say that I'm joined with the staff of the Laurel Historical Society, Monica Sturgeon and Riley Matson. So they will be helping me to monitor the chat. And again, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to put it in the chat box, and I will put all the links that you need to know down in there as well. Again, thank you for joining us tonight. This is being recorded, as we heard twice now, so I will pass it over to Henry and just say thank you so much for joining us tonight and welcome.
Thank you, Anne. Okay, I'm hoping everybody see and hear me? Got to get a nod or a thumbs up or?
Yep.
All righty. Well, then I guess then we will go ahead and get started. All right. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you all for having me in. And thank for Anne and the folks from the Laurel Historical Society. Actually, neighbors. I've actually lived in Savage for many years, and so as they mentioned, I am both a professional archaeologist with a master's degree from the University of Delaware, but also took some time out of being an archaeologist to come and get a cooking degree at the Baltimore Culinary Arts Institute right here in Charm City. And it was sort of a logical thing. I had loved cooking since I was a kid, and I loved archaeology since my first exposure to it. And so at some point, I guess it was, fated that those two things would come together and that I would begin to look at food from an archaeological perspective. So we'll talk a little bit about how I got onto that path, and then also focus on a specific meal for a specific group. This for the Lenape tribe of Delaware. We did an indigenous feast for them for an estuary environmental meeting. And it was a really nice way to sort of bring a lot of what we had learned together about the foods and the nutrition and the history, and tell a story about, again, foods that would have been eaten by the people from the native groups of the Chesapeake and the Delaware going back thousands of years. All right, I would like to start off with one acknowledgement. One, I am not a native person. I have a couple of drops of indigenous blood within me, but that does not give me the right to talk about these foods as if they were my own. And so I am not presenting this as a native person. I'm presenting it as an archaeologist. I always tell people that archaeologists, we do the dishes. We dig up the bones, we dig up the pots and the fireplaces. And so we sort of know the food in a way that we will always listen and learn from anybody that will tell us about their food ways, but we also can access that information in a different way. And so I don't need to make believe that it is my food or my people. And that leads me into, again, something that we should do pretty much every day, is to acknowledge the fact that we are on borrowed land or stolen land, that in Baltimore or in Maryland, as you can see on this map, we are living on the ancestral lands of the Nanticoke and the Susquehanna and the Lenape and the Algonquin and the Piscataway. And so we need to acknowledge the fact that we are on this land is because it was taken away from these peoples, but they are still here and they deserve our respect and they deserve our acknowledgement each time we talk about the places that we work and live. And I would go beyond that and say that there's also a labor and land acknowledgement that we should pay to other underrepresented and marginalized people. This is, again, a map from 1860 showing the African American population of Maryland and the adjacent states at that time period. And the fact that much of the labor that went ahead and built the roads and built the railroads and the buildings and the things, the infrastructure that we work and live in and enjoy every day, again, was built by enslaved peoples or people who were marginalized and not acknowledged and not paid adequately for the labor that they put forward to produce these things. And so again, we just need to acknowledge that, utilize that part of our history. We don't need to get tied up in that, but we do need to acknowledge it and be able to put that into perspective. Okay, it's a little bit interesting. I got an archaeological degree from the University of Delaware and started off as a prehistoric archaeologist. But at one point, as I transferred down to working for the Baltimore City Life Museums, I took some time out to actually go to cooking school to fulfill a dream of mine. I'd always loved cooking as a kid. And it got hard to do archaeology at that point in sort of the late 80s. So I took some time out, went to cooking school, and began to, again, learn how to actually be a professional chef and how to learn about food and the science and the hygiene and the nutrition and everything else. And in that process, sort of these two ideas came together, and I began to think about the things that I had dug up on these sites, to think about the turkey bones, to think about the pumpkin seeds, and what kind of meals would they have represented? What kind of food was that? And I began to realize that we really do know a lot about archaeological sites. We know a lot about the resources available. We know about the plants available. We can look at the pollen. We can look at the seeds. We know, again, what the seasonings would have been. And I began to realize that, I mean, again, salt and corn is a very old recipe, but one that's pretty stable. And that I could probably go ahead and, as a cook, begin to reconstruct these foods. And so that became a journey of exploration of everything from, again, it's my first cookbook up in the left-hand side, peanuts, but, medieval feast and a Mayan festival and a Chinese American festival and powwows and all sorts of different groups and periods, looking at food from different time periods and realizing the story that that told in each of those cultures. I had an opportunity to go out and work in Central Ohio as an undergraduate, an amazing place. If no one, if you love archaeology, it's a part of America that you should go and visit. Both amazing mounds like this Serpent Mound down in Licking, but also I got an opportunity to work at the Ohio Historical Society, which is the repository of the amazing materials that came out of, again, the Adena and Hopewell cultures in Central Ohio and the Midwest. That is my burial mound up in the upper right-hand corner, not quite as exciting, but it did give me an opportunity to work in that museum and see those kinds of artifacts. I returned actually on a sabbatical to go ahead and do a salvage excavation in the upper Chesapeake Bay, a little island that ended up being part of a remarkable prehistoric site that sort of opened my eyes to sort of, again, amazing resources that we had out in the upper Chesapeake Bay region and in the Chesapeake and Delaware in general. But this was the site that actually near one of my grandparents' house, and had been out to this island and had gathered arrowheads with my grandfather. But I had an opportunity to come back and do a salvage excavation and find out it's pretty amazing multi-phase base camp that was occupied literally from not quite Paleo-Indian, but for about 9,000 years. And on this site, we ended up having not only the earliest kinds of prehistoric pottery that was used in the area, but also the latest. And then in between all of those, about 14 different prehistoric ceramic types. And so again, this is a point where, again, I'm looking at cooking and hunting tools. I'm looking at these pots, different kinds of pots made different ways in different time period. And again, that began to have the sort of that nascent cook begin to ask questions about what is going on here. This site is also quite remarkable, is that these folks had a connection into the local trade and exchange network that actually extended all the way out to Central Ohio. This is an Adena leaf-shaped robin's blade that was found on the site in Maryland. Amazingly enough, we find Adena out in Central Ohio and in Kent County and Maryland and Kent County, Delaware. a very strange sort of colony that we're still trying to work out. But again, another remarkable tool. This one, interestingly, probably not a hunting or cooking tool. The interpretation of these is that these are actually being used to break down human cadavers to be able to fit them into cremation basins as part of the funerary practice for these people who were, again, these transplants from central Ohio out onto the Delmarva Peninsula. I had an opportunity then to go ahead to go to University of Delaware and learned and taught there, got my master's degree, had a couple of amazing adventures, including getting sent off on a shipwreck. These are various views related to the HMS Shadroe, a British man of war that went down off the coast of Delaware in 1798. And again, remarkable preservation because of the underwater environment and the anaerobic, limited oxygen environment. But again, even with the materials that we found on this military man of war, we ended up finding things that, again, tickle the fancy of the chef. This is, in fact, a ketchup bottle. It's only about 3 inches tall, and it would have been filled with something probably made out of mushrooms instead of tomato. But again, it was just interesting to see that this little condiment bottle probably sat on that captain's table. His name was Captain Drew, and he would have been the captain of the vessel when it went down. So again, a remarkable experience because on every site, again, we do the dishes. We find what people were eating, what they were drinking. I've always been fascinated by raw materials. We talked about Herring Island. This is a site where there's an amazing raw material that is actually very interestingly used just to make a limited set of tools during a limited time period, but also had an opportunity to look at some very early jasper and chert quarries along the Maryland and Delaware line. And all those led me to my favorite, which was actually an opportunity to go ahead and do a survey of a series of steatite bowl quarries along the Maryland and Pennsylvania line and up into Lancaster. A steatite, as I'll talk about later, is a very soft material. It's about as hard as your fingernail, which means you can actually carve it very easily into cooking vessels. And so these are a whole series of different kinds of cooking vessels of different grades of material that we found on this one site on the Maryland side of the line. And again, I was looking at these and it's like, okay, this one actually you could tell was a really long, sort of elongated size, where this one again was clearly larger and shallower. And just beginning, okay, is this a baking vessel and this is a wok, or what exactly are these things being used for and how are they being used to cook? And so we'll get back to this because it's, again, one of my favorite materials. After my adventures in Delaware, I moved down to Baltimore, went to cooking school essentially simultaneously as I was working for the Baltimore Center of City Life Museums and the Baltimore Center for Urban Archaeology. And the urban archaeological context gave us a remarkable opportunity again to look at that interaction between people and food. This was the excavations that we did for the Market Center Shot Tower Metro. Basically, we came down under the parking lot. We had known from historic records that this had been part of the Market Center that had been burned in the Great Fire. But we also realized that there had been a fire station put in on this lot as the ground floor of the building. So it did not have a basement. And so as we tested, we found out that those buildings were actually intact below the surface, about 3 feet. And so we came down on the remains of this market neighborhood that was built during the 1790s and then diminished again, and then eventually was wiped out by the Great Baltimore Fire. And as we excavated the site, we found not only the remains of what was in that grocery store at the time it burned on that Sunday morning in 1907, but also we found a couple of privies full of material from both the late 18th and the 19th century, giving us a complete table setting of what it would have looked like to have people again sitting at the table. Very nice. This is actually intact, what's called a case bottle. These are square bottles that were able to be packed into a square case in a way that made them survive shipping better. They also love this little thing here, although it's not a food item. This is actually a oil lamp, but it's quite a small one. And it's been identified for me as what was called a courting lamp. this is a lamp that you would put a small amount of oil in, and it would basically acted like sort of a timer. So a couple could court as long as the oil burned, but as soon as it burned out, the date was over. And again, this is our building that we excavated was right here on the corner of Baltimore Street and Center Market. And so this is what is now Market Center. And the Children's Museum is like right in here. And so this was one of the major markets for the city of Baltimore. And unfortunately was just on the edge of what was devastated during the Great Fire. And in fact, this wall here, this is the standing wall of what had been the Maryland Hall, which was the building on the site before the fire. Got an opportunity then to go in with my current job with WSP to go ahead and work with the Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority. You wouldn't think that they would need an archaeologist, but between the two airports, we have 13,000 acres inside the fence. And on that acreage, we have a number of remarkable prehistoric sites, some very interesting African-American slave sites that we have found out at Dulles, the remains of a colonial plantation in the middle of National Airport at Abington, and then amazing architectural resources, both national and then the amazing main terminal of Aero Serenins at Dulles. Again, I want to throw a plug in here for this is one of my favorite sites at the airport. So this is the remains of Abington Plantation, which was the colonial plantation owned by the Alexander family, but eventually owned by the Custuses, the Hunters, the Wise, a number of other very famous families. And again, it's in the middle of National Airport in between the two parking structures. So the next time you're flying in, go ahead and take a look. It's in a remarkable site. Again, it was owned by both the Custuses and Alexanders when they were the wealthiest families in Virginia at that time period. And so some of the archaeological resources we found on the site, I had never seen anyplace else. That is the Wedgwood cauliflower creamware vessel there. And I'd only ever seen this in books before, but we actually found a fragment of this. I was walking up to a Bacter pile and looked down and said, huh, it looks like cauliflower. And sure enough, again, very refined wares coming in all the way from England. But the site was also occupied by the people who made the plantation run. There were always more Afro-American enslaved people at Abington and any plantation than there ever were the white property owners or the overseers. And the vessel we have down here is an example, historical example, of a Colonna-ware vessel. We found a couple of fragments of this, both at Abington and at sites at Dulles, and finally have realized over the years that this is actually a Afro-American pottery technology. They're using local clays, West African ceramic technology to basically make the cooking vessels that they do not have the financial wherewithal to be able to buy. And these folks did not have money. They didn't have anything really that they could barter with to go ahead and buy a European vessel. So, but they did not let them stop them. They went ahead and made their own vessels. And again, interestingly, these are vessels that are tied back to that West African culinary tradition of gumbos and stews and other kinds of brothy things that you could cook for a long time to soften and make the tender things that might not have been tender at the start. And so again, I think I always love Colonna-ware because to me it seems like an example of the resilience of people. It's like, okay, if they cannot buy the pot they need to make the stew they want, then they're going to make it. And so again, a remarkable part of that story. It's also on the airport interesting. Everywhere I turn around, there's something having to do with a little bit of cooking or eating. And so this is actually a restoration we did of the original 1940 dining room. Quite an amazing, sort of little Art Deco jewel that had been lost through time that we're able to restore and be able to put back the way it looked. On the right-hand side is the way it looks today, and then the photograph of it originally. And this was sort of fun because we actually even got a chance to go ahead and recreate some of the table settings. These are plates that were actually made by Ethel Warren Pilson, who was the interior decorator for the club. You can't really see it, but the handles of the silverware are actually the airplane fuselage. And so again, we have restored this dining room. It is now actually part of an airline club, but it's still available to be toured at the airport if you make an appointment. We're going to leave the airports now and go off to a little bit more of the topic of conversation today. And this is the taking off point for today's exploration of foods, a recipe and a menu that I put together for a project we did for the Lenape tribe of Delaware to explore the restoration of the Delaware estuary, particularly bringing back the freshwater mussel. And because of the topic and the fact that it was hosted by the tribe, they asked me to come in and do an indigenous meal. And so I thought this would be an interesting way, rather than sort of going through a chronology of time, to go through a menu and just look at each of these items and talk a little bit about the story it tells and a little bit about that way of cooking and what it tells us about the past. Again, I would like to thank again the Lenape for inviting me and involving me in the project. This is Chief Dennis Coker on the right-hand side, and some of his family actually down at the National American Museum Cultural Resource Center, looking at some traditional fishing nets that were actually made by Lenape and Lenape folks 100 years ago. We actually got a chance to see some fishing lures and things that were actually made by one of his ancestors, and also canoes that were also made by a neighboring tribe. So quite remarkable that this material culture still exists and can be shared. And here is Dennis watching me at work in the process of preparing the meal. And this is actually down in the Cheswold area of Delaware, near Dover, where the Lenape of Delaware are actually a significant part of the native population. They have been there for thousands of years and are still there and still a vibrant part of the everyday goings on of that area. Let's go back a little bit further back in time and talk a bit about food and prehistory. If we go back, we're beginning to understand now with time that time and the occupation of North America probably was a little bit older than we had thought. Our first understanding, and the way I was taught as I was growing up, is that Native Americans came across a land bridge from Asia following large animals, megafauna, at the end of the last ice age that made their way down into North America and eventually down through South America. And these sort of big game hunters were characterized by these beautifully made, what are called fluted points. If you look at this point, you can see that there's actually this large flake that's been taken off one side. There'll be one taken off the other side. And when you split the haft and slide the wood up, you can then haft this on in a way that holds it very tightly. And these are actually some of the most beautifully made stone tools we find in North America, because if you're going after an elephant, you've got to have a really sharp spear. And this is actually a view of the Pleistocene animals that would have been, in this case, in Mexico, but it was such a great graphic to show you the range of the mastodons, mammoths, the giant sloths, dire wolf, cave bears, bison and bison antiqua that would have been roaming across the North American continent and would have been part of what these people have been living on. We used to think that they sort of just like took down an elephant and then ate on that until they got sick of it. We began to realize from other sites that they had a much broader range of foods that they were relying on. And again, we're also beginning to realize that this model of people arriving at that time period, 12 to 14,000 years ago, may not be the final answer. We're beginning to find sites that hint at an occupation that goes back further than that. Sites that we really weren't completely sure of in the past, we're beginning to kind of have to come to terms with that there may have been other waves of occupation, other people that came over in what we're now calling the pre-Clovis. These would be considered to be Clovis points. And so this pre-Clovis culture is something that we're just beginning to get our hands on. And again, quite exciting that even after all these years, archaeology is still being discovered and we're still finding out new material. All right, here is North America when, at that time period, again, we're talking about the Ice Age. A lot of the water on the planet is capped in these big ice caps. The ice would have come down, I believe it was almost a mile deep in parts of Pennsylvania. And so as we get into the warming trend, the global warming, I'm sorry, we're going to talk about climate change. Those ice caps melted and the sea level began to rise. That had a dramatic effect. And one of the things is you can see up here that there is actually the connection between Asia and North America is still existing. But as we begin that cycle of the sea level rising, again, we begin to, this is that land bridge we talked about where they're coming across, coming down through an ice-free river valley into the East Coast and onto the East Coast. But again, one of the problems, again, with these earliest sites and figuring out when these people arrived is the fact that, again, we have that change in the environment with the sea level having risen already from the last ice age. Most of those sites where they would have been out on the coast are no longer on the coast. They're actually out on the coastal plain. And as you would imagine, archaeology is difficult enough to do on land, but to try to do and look for prehistoric sites underwater out on the coastal plain is something we're still coming to terms with. And again, a trend that we are actually seem to be beginning to repeat. As the again, temperatures begin to rise again, we are beginning to get inundation. And in this case, the East Coast will be the place that probably takes the biggest brunt of it, where Baltimore, which is now up at the head of the estuary, will end up being beachfront property again. Now, well, let's talk about the estuary. This is the Chesapeake Bay. It is one of the most richest in ecosystems on the entire planet at its height. It was the source of so much food and so for so many different peoples for so many different reasons. And again, it was one of these sort of the impetus for people to have moved into the area. But we have to remember that the Chesapeake Bay, as we think of it today, did not exist as we go back that far. It was basically the Susquehanna River Valley, which you can basically sort of follow in blue here, that went ahead and came all the way from New York, all the way through Pennsylvania, down through Maryland, and the lower Susquehanna River Valley was what became the Chesapeake Bay as the water level rose at the end of the last ice age and the water flooded up into that river valley, causing the Chesapeake Bay. Same thing happened with the Delaware River and the Delaware Bay. But prior to the development of the bay, this was still, again, a very productive and attractive environment. And so we do have people, again, moving in and expanding and filling in different ecological niches at the end of the last ice age, the period we call Paleo-Indian, associated again with that Clovis fluted culture, and moving into the next period we call the Archaic, where you can sort of see things becoming more complicated in natural environments developing as the climate stabilized and people beginning to move into areas and stay placed a little bit more. One of the things we see with the Paleo-Indian is you'll find points that are made out of a raw material that may be states away, where people actually are sort of nomadically moving back and forth at some level with these large herds of animals. In this time period, they're beginning to settle down, move away as those larger animals become extinct, to focusing on a wider range of different kinds of resources like deer and beaver and rabbit and bear and elk and other of the larger mammals that survived the extinction at the end of the Pleistocene. And how we get a lot of this information on this sort of the next early period is that we find some really well-preserved sites, in many cases in these caves or rock shelters, which really preserve this process of seeing people moving from that sort of nomadic time, where they were moving along the landscape in broader swaths to settling down, becoming sort of more hunters and gatherers, and becoming more regionally focused. And so again, this is sort of this idea, not like of a nomad moving for long distances, but what we call tethered nomadism, where again, you may move up to the area of the Susquehanna River to get the shad run in the spring, but then move to another location to get berries when they become available, or up into the uplands to get nuts in the fall, or know where the deer go and hide, where they stand in the winter, and so you might need closer to that resource. So again, not moving from one state to another, but moving around within that environment. And again, this sort of tethered nomadism and hunting and gathering was what we feel, sort of was characterizing that archaic time period, which then was replaced by the woodland. And so this is characterized by the movement from hunting and gathering to actual agriculture, to horticulture, with the movement of both the idea and the seeds of corn and squash and beans coming up from Mesoamerica, up the Mississippi River Valley, and into this area, and not supplanting, but beginning to supplement what people were eating. And again, it's very important that these foods are really give you the opportunity with horticulture, not to just gather what nature is giving you in any particular season, but planting enough seeds that you can be fairly confident that you're going to get a crop. And that makes a big difference because all of a sudden you're not having to move around. And that has limits what you can do in terms of a population. Basically, if you're a hunter and gatherer, every child has to be carried. If there's not somebody to carry the child, they have to be old enough to walk. Well, if you plant corn and you stay there and the next year you harvest the corn and you plant more corn the following year, not only you're not able to move around as much, but you have a more stable source of protein to be able to build a larger population and begin to become more sedentary. And so it is in this woodland time period after the Archaic where we begin to see these settlements of larger and larger groups of people staying in one place at one time. And unfortunately, for history and culture, this was the condition that a lot of the groups in the North America and the Eastern Shore and on the Eastern Coast were in when the Europeans began to arrive. So this is one of these famous lithographs by Thomas White showing a Susquehannock village. In this case, one of the things that really stands out is this stockaded village. And again, this is, we believe, again, an artifact of this idea of longer term settlements, agricultural villages. You can see the crops that are planted here. Once you have a crop in the ground, you really can't leave. You need to stay there. And unfortunately, then that means that if somebody knows you have that crop and might want to take it from you, you begin to get into this like conflict that may not have been as prevalent in earlier time periods where people were able to move around and sort of stay out of each other's way. People now being drawn down into the floodplains where there was fertile ground that could be made into farms. And we believe that that was beginning to bring some conflict in. And so these palisades are actually protective. They're to protect you from, again, the potential of raids or war with your neighbors. All right, well, how do archaeologists tell about food? We've talked about the fact that, again, we dig up the bones. Bones are actually pretty stable under most conditions. These down here, you can see, actually may have been partially burned. This actually helps to stabilize them. It goes ahead and reduces, some of the protein and makes a little bit more carbon, which has a tendency to last better. And it's sort of interesting that when we think about destroying something, we would think about burning it. As it turns out, burning is not always that effective because in this case, you can see down here, these are actually fruit seeds which have been burned, but they've been reduced to carbon. And so although these are hundreds or thousands of years old, they are completely stable and we can find them and be able to identify them. And again, we don't ever find sort of the soft planting materials, so we're finding the seeds, but also then the pollens, because we can actually look into the soil and extract the very, very small pollen grains, which will not only tell us what people may have been eating, because again, we've been processing the plants in their camp, but what might have been growing around them, which just gives us environmental information. But here we actually have, again, the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash. And we'll talk more about this in the past. But again, a lot of what we know about the native foodways comes from those kinds of remains. Also, we need to think about the fact that we actually consume a fairly limited number of animals today in our culture. But going back in time, they would have gone ahead and eaten anything that was available and was nutritious and that could be caught. And so, again, you can see here reptiles and snakes and eels and turtles and all kinds of things that are no longer on the menu today would have been part of what they were eating back then. And so here we have the menu. And so we're just going to go ahead and sort of walk through these and talk about what they can tell us about the food and the time period. All right, one of the things about an estuary, and in this case, this is the Delaware, is that you basically have ocean, salt water at the mouth, at the Atlantic, and then the fresh water from the Delaware River up at the head of from the mouth to the head. And so somewhere along that estuary, you essentially have every salinity that you might have between fresh and salt. And so that gives you a micro growing environment where all of these different kinds of animals like oysters and shrimp and crabs and like herring can flourish. They may not flourish at the head, or they may not flourish at the mouth, but somewhere along that continuum they will. And in fact, anybody that lives in the area knows you can sort of see the crabs coming up the coast and eventually up the bay as the water rises and as the salinity changes. These bays also, again, they're part of the flyway for these astounding numbers of waterfowl that moved up and down the eastern seaboard, and are also a magnet for all sorts of other kinds of game animals. And so, again, these estuaries were literally just a grocery store that had almost anything that anybody could want to eat. And so they became a magnet that drew people into the area and really kind of kick-started the cultural environment through prehistory. So for this meal, we went ahead and made what I call a Chesapeake Bay consomme. We started actually awfully to get the woodlands in with a turkey stock, but then mixed in some crab, a little bit of smoked oysters, little shrimp, and then some sautéed leek leaves, which I think sort of look a little bit like seaweed and give you that idea that if the Chesapeake Bay could be a bowl of soup, that it might actually be pretty delicious back in the past. I'm not sure that I would drink a bowl of it today. We also acknowledge the fact that there are vegetarians, and actually many of the Lenape are vegetarians. So we also ended up with a winter squash soup, in this case garnished with some toasted walnuts and a little bit of sage oil. But one of the things that I have found in researching these foods is that very often the native foodway is extremely healthy one. It's lean proteins, lots of greens, nuts, berries, really wide variety, not much in the way of like concentrated or refined sugars at all or starches. And so in this case, again, both of these soups are actually quite low in fat, high in omega acid and the minerals. It's also interesting when I am trying to go ahead and recreate food from any sort of time period, I have to look at the plants that are available. And it's interesting that although there are 1,000 different plants out in the woods that would have had some sort of culinary or medicinal use for Native Americans, there are very few of them have, continued to be used today. I mean, mint, mustard, sage, um, you know, uh, uh, not even the onion. We have a wild onion, but not the kind of the Spanish onion that we use today. And so very often, if I'm trying to recreate a flavor, I cannot go back to the native ingredient because I don't know what it is. And I have to come up with a substitute flavor. And so again, I feel that I'm actually the one who's having to kind of cheat. I'm having to use something which tastes a little bit like the native ingredient. For a long time, I wasn't able to get spice bush, which is a local woodland plant that has a little red berry with a very distinctive, really wonderful sort of allspice flavor. And again, I couldn't get it, so I used allspice. Well, now I can get all the spice bush, and it's a very different flavor and very subtle. And the outside of the berry and the seed have a different flavor. And so again, being able to go ahead and actually use some of those native ingredients is actually sort of fun. We also need to be careful because these are fiddlehead ferns, which are actually just becoming, coming up in the ground now, and also leeks, the wild leek or the ramp, which will be coming up soon, have gotten to the point where foragers and people who collect wild plants have begun to actually endanger these. We're beginning to find out that leeks are becoming harder and harder to find because they're being harvested too much and not naturally being allowed to go ahead and reconstitute. So in this case, if I can get ramps and I know that they have been ethically harvested, I will use them. But I also realize that a little bit of onion, a little bit of garlic, and a little bit of shallots cooked down is a very, very similar flavor and one that can be done without, damaging the environment. The next the item we're going to talk about is oysters Nanacoke. This is a recipe I came up to celebrate one of, we think of the crab as the Maryland symbol, but I mean, the oyster is probably and arguably even more important to the Bay. I mean, it was the industrial harvesting of oysters, which really drove a lot of the economy of the Eastern Shore. And again, we know this because, we find these very durable shells that were left behind both from historical time periods, but also from prehistory. Now, this is actually a pretty big oyster, but I'm pretty sure that this is not actually a prehistoric one. Probably historic because if you look very carefully, one, it is still very dense. Very often, prehistoric oysters are roasted open rather than shucked. And so, in this case, if you look very carefully, you'll see over here damage on this side and here. Looks like this one has been shucked open. The Native Americans did not have a metal tool. They would have had native copper, but nowhere near tensile enough to be able to actually shuck an oyster open. So again, if you see a sort of chalky gray shell, that's probably been roasted and might be prehistoric. Whereas if you see one that is still solid but may have some edge damage, that's likely to be an historic example. And here you can see that roasting oysters is still something that's done today, the way of going ahead and opening them up and imparting, a really nice flavor. And so in this case, we went with something essentially sort of an oysters Rockefeller with the oysters steamed, roasted open, and then topped with a mixture of that leek mixture, some walnuts, a little bit of cornmeal, and sea salt to go ahead and give a nice little flavoring to these smoked and roasted oysters. Pretty delicious. Everybody who tries them loves this preparation. And again, you can see here, this is another one of White's talking about just the wide range of all the different kinds of animals and sea animals, and this is eels, and we got turtle here, and also this is a ray, and also some idea of the sort of the cooking techniques. You can see here, this is what's called a lester or a fish spear, but also you can see this is a weir in the back here, where they're basically using reeds to go ahead and build these impounds. So as the fish come down the river, they'll be directed into these and they can be collected. And again, you can see here they're fishing and spearing all sorts of different materials. And the bones and the shells of all these animals end up in these amazing shell middens. I've excavated a few of these on the eastern shore. They literally extend like hundreds of feet along the shore and are 5 to 6 feet deep. And they're literally just the remains of thousands and thousands of these oyster meals, people coming down onto the bluffs, going ahead and roasting them open. And it's interesting too where you end up finding these shells. So again, if you're in Baltimore, you may recognize that this is Mount Clair in southwest Baltimore in Carroll Park. And this is what it looked like back in the 18th century. This was the mansion home of Charles Carroll, the barrister, and Margaret Tillman Carroll, who again, one of the wealthiest families in Maryland at that time. And I was involved with excavations and archaeology in the remains of the site. Again, this is really interesting view that it just turns out that Mount Clair was actually preserved within this park-like setting of Carroll Park. So as the rest of the area built up, it actually was remained as a wide open parkland. And you can sort of get a sense of what it would have felt like and looked like in that 18th century, with these wide open falling gardens and expansive views. And so the work that I did out there with the Baltimore City Life Museums, Center for Urban Archaeology, and the Colonial Dames of America in the state of Maryland was to go ahead and do excavations to attempt to reconstruct some of the features of the colonial plantation. And so again, we did excavations that found the office and kitchen wings, and those were reconstructed in 2 dimensions so people could see where they were. Also, the gate and the fence that surrounded the property, including actually recovering a portion of one of the ears of one of the lions that were then reconstructed and put back in front of the house. But for me, I think one of the most amazing things we found in the excavation was actually down on the second terrace on the riverside of the house, underneath a Olmsted Brothers walkway. we started coming down on this concentration of shell that was higher than we found anyplace else. We always thought that the shell might have been out there to make lime to build some of the brick buildings that they used to make mortar in the early time period. But as we began to excavate this thing very carefully, we were not finding any historic artifacts in it. But we did begin to find tiny little fragments of two different kinds of prehistoric pottery. And we then again very carefully found some charcoal. We're able to go ahead and get a pretty nice tight date for this sealed shell midden. And so again, we have here the remains of an oyster dinner up on a hillside overlooking the Patapsco River, going back a couple of thousand years. So people have been eating oysters in Baltimore for a very long time. Another interesting thing about the oysters, if you look at them very carefully at where the hinge comes together, you'll see these growth rings. This is actually like tree rings. The oyster grows faster during warm weather and then goes into dormancy and then grows fast. And you can get a sense of not only the environmental factors of what the growing environment for the oyster was like, but mathematically, you can also figure out sometimes when they were being harvested, whether it was early or late in the growth year. And it's interesting that we seem to be finding consistently that a lot of these oysters are being harvested in the late winter and early spring. Now, it turns out that is when they're the most nutritious. But if you consider the fact that you're not diving, there's no diving suits, there's no tongs, there's no dredges, that trying to get these oysters up off the bottom was probably meant that you were out there actually, wading out into pretty cold water to get these big chunks of, these near shore oysters onto shore to go ahead and eat them. And again, this a little bit of a change of our perspective because we tend to think of seafood as being the most deluxe, the most expensive, the fanciest of our food choices. But if the fact that you're waiting out to get these kinds of oysters suggests that you're really hungry and that this might have been a sort of a food of last resort and that you have used up all of your stored corn and your venison and everything else. Everybody's getting hungry. And again, you're waiting for the other crops and the other hunting to begin. And so the oysters are a way that you're filling in the gaps in your food environment. All right, everyone, always talks about the three sisters. And so this is corn, beans, and squash. They came as a set, again, as we said, up from South and Central America. They're a remarkable combination for a couple of reasons. One is that they actually grow pretty well together and are very tolerant of different kinds of growing conditions. And so this is actually very often you would find that the corn would be planted on a stalk, on a mound. The bean would then climb up the stalk, and the squash would then be planted at the base. And the leaves of the squash help to keep the weeds down and keep the moisture into the mound. So the three of them actually grow quite, well together. It's also interesting that any one of the three of them is not a particularly great nutritional package. They have some amino acids, but not a complete protein set. And so if you actually have all three of them in your diet, you're getting this sort of triple whammy where you're filling in some of the gaps. And you're actually coming up with a pretty close to meat quality protein from these three vegetarian ingredients. And that's actually really interesting because it seems like this may have an effect on the rest of the foodway. We have very little evidence in North America of people domesticating animals for food. We know that they hunted everything, and maybe some evidence that they may have domesticated or at least penned turkeys. But again, not deer, not almost every other culture in the temperate planet has some sort of mammal, a pig, a horse, a llama, a water buffalo, a something that eventually gets eaten. We don't really have it here. And again, it may be that the three sisters are giving people a solid foundation of protein, which is going to keep them healthy. And so the meat protein can become a flavoring, can be something you can eat or if you want to, a garnish, but it isn't something that you have to go out and hunt every day in order to stay healthy. And so again, I think it may meant that you could go ahead and hunt and gather your meats rather than actually having to invest the time into building a pen and getting the feed and becoming an animal husbandry, to become a herder. It just doesn't seem like that was something in this area that happened with Native Americans until probably you get into the later time periods in the Southwest with um, the sheep and the Navajo. But again, really not part of the indigenous Native American foodway. And so succotash, I actually kind of wondered about including it because it's a little bit of a, you know, um, something that everybody always has heard about as Native American, but it is also quite delicious and also amazingly nutritious. And it gives us an opportunity to actually bring all the three sisters together. Very often when we have succotash, it's usually corn and lima beans, but in this case, we've come up with something a little bit more indigenous. So we're including winter squash, in this case, butternut, yellow corn, and again, a small red bean that we know archaeologically is probably closer to the indigenous bean. As you can tell by the name, the lima bean, actually is more prevalent in South America. A little bit of vegetable stock, some sunflower oil, and again, that little wild leek mixture. In this case, I'm not using ramps, but I'm using the mixture of onions and garlic and shallots. A little bit of the spice bush, which actually is a really nice, that allspice brings out the sweetness of the squash really nicely. A little bit of sea salt. So again, the next time you're thinking about making succotash, think about going ahead and adding squash to it and bringing all three sisters to the table. Again, one of the significant meat animals in this area would have been the turkey. And we now know from looking, actually archaeologists looking at some genetic information from bones that have been recovered, we seem to see less genetic variability in some of these turkey populations than we would think if they were truly wild. So there seems to be some possibility that they may have actually been domesticated. There are some features out in the southwest of the Pueblos which are being interpreted as turkey pens. And so again, it is possible that this sort of blurs that line about a meat animal, but again, not a mammal. And so in this case, we're using, it's interesting that the sort of the standard game seasoning that we use in this country really has a lot of indigenous ingredients. The juniper berry, the bay leaves, and the mustard that are all part of that seasoning are again indigenous to this area. Also, again, a little bit of a vinegar that I make out of maple. And so we go ahead and sauteed the turkey breasts and smoke them over hardwood for about 4 hours. And that is served with the classic accompaniment, which is the cranberry. We'll talk a little bit about the cranberry and berries later, but again, there's nothing quite like that combination. And again, turkey is a great example of, again, one of these really lean proteins. And each of the herbs and the spices that we use, as you can see here, all have medicinal and health benefits. And again, every herb that they would have used for a culinary purpose also probably had at least one or two medicinal purposes. It was just part of, they knew how each plant not only tasted, but how it would affect the body. And again, here is, don't be too intimidated with your smoking. This is my little vertical charcoal smoker with 3 full turkey breasts underway over cherry wood. And the turkey came out really delicious. And so this is a plate that we put together of the turkey and mushrooms and succotash with a little bit of cranberry for the event. One of the other thoughts we had in terms of a main dish is also something very indigenous, actually just to this area, just basically sort of to the Mid-Atlantic, maybe up into New York, Connecticut, and that is planking shad. Shad is one of these anadromous fish. So it's a fish that spawns in freshwater, goes out into the ocean to live and grow to an adult, and then comes back to the same stream, like salmon you've always heard about, to go ahead and spawn the next generation. Well, again, these estuaries are the highways for these kinds of fish. Remember, the salt water and access to the ocean, and then again, the freshwater streams where they were spawned. The other thing is that these fish do not come back randomly. They come back at one time period, and what are called these fish runs that usually occur in the spring. And so these things could have been truly astounding, where you would have millions of fish coming out of the ocean into these smaller and smaller and smaller bodies of water until they would eventually get to the Susquehanna and the James and the Rappahannock. and would be just these solid masses of fish moving up. And the opportunity for these native peoples to come in and mass harvest these and to go ahead and dry them and store them almost again at a level that's almost like horticulture. This is taking hunting and gathering to the highest level, where the limitation is just the number of people that you can get down to the river on that couple of weeks in April. You could get all the protein you could possibly eat and like feed the entire village if you could be efficient. And so this is a really interesting coastal adaptation that you find in estuaries, where people are actually able to focus on a marine food almost the way they would as if they had harvested a crop or if they had a domesticated animal. Pretty amazing stuff. And so this is actually an event I did for the Catoctin Furnace Historical Society, where we actually tried planking a shad, in this case, nailing it to a board with a little bit of bacon and propping it up in front of the fire, but a pretty amazing and very ancient way to cook. And one that, again, it's something that every person in the area in the spring knew the shad were coming, and it didn't make any difference if you were red, black, Native American, black, white, poor, an immigrant. It was this remarkable bounty where it was so cheap that everybody could eat it. And if you look around, it is still tradition today for families to get together in the spring and to plank shad, and their political events or barn dances. And again, this idea of looking at that cycle of the seasons and taking advantage of the native bounty. The other interesting thing about, again, these fish that are coming in is they're returning to spawn. And so very many of them are gravid females. And so this is actually some Shadroe, the fish sacks from the shad. And this was actually my grandmother and my mother's favorite delicacy of the spring, is when the shad come in, they would begin to look for this like Chesapeake caviar. That raised an interesting question for me, because one of the remarkable experiences as a kid, I was probably 13 or 14, we went to the state fair in Northeast, and there was a 14-foot sturgeon on display, which again was just like the biggest fish I had ever seen, and they had caught it in the Northeast River. So he was coming back from the Atlantic, coming up all the way through the Chesapeake Bay into the Northeast, and was about to go up the Susquehanna when he was caught. And again, remarkable, again, these sturgeon would have been this size during prehistoric time periods. In fact, they're incredibly hard to catch. They're like sort of prehistoric monsters. These are actually bony plates that you probably cannot spear through. And so you actually were trying to lasso their tail in shallow water. But it also raises an interesting question: is these fish are that size, coming up to this river, would have been a remarkable thing. And what we have up here, this is actually outlined in chalk, a carved petroglyph that had been at the Bald Friar petroglyphs above where the Susquehanna Dam is now, and were carved by the Native Americans for some sort of reason. We assume that it has religious or spiritual significance. But also, if you look at that, that looks an awful like you're looking in the face of a fish. And I have to imagine that some of these petroglyphs had to be about this remarkable bounty. During historical time periods on the Susquehanna, you would harvest shad with a pitchfork. You would walk out in the water and literally just spear a fish, throw it over your shoulder, and spear another one and throw it over your shoulder. And so, again, the fact that the petroglyphs are there and this fish remunds, I think it's got to be this tie-in somehow. It also raises, just from the culinary standpoint, if you have a gravid sturgeon of that size, you're talking about probably 3 or 4 pounds of caviar. And again, we don't have any recipes. We don't have any idea how these fish necessarily would have been prepared, but we have to know that, again, they were not throwing anything away. So there were prehistoric Susquehannock recipes for serving caviar. I just wish I could figure out what they were. All right, another thing that we have in this area and is beginning to come in, I have friends who are actually getting ready to go out and hunt morel mushrooms, are the fungi. And so that was something else that, again, is indigenous. There's lots of different kinds of mushrooms out there. They would have been part of the native diet throughout the eastern woodlands. And again, all sorts of different flavors and textures. However, also one of those things you want to be really careful about. I am not a wild mushroom gatherer because, I mean, I've been told every mushroom is edible, but some are only edible once. And so here's a very simple saute we did: a little bit of walnut oil, a little bit of vegetable stock, a little bit of crisped sage, and a scattering of pumpkin seeds. Again, this is one of the other dishes that we prepared to be able to provide the vegetarian crowd with a nice full plate. Again, we talked about again the health benefits, and here again very low fat, all sorts of anti-inflammatory, and good vitamin content. We also, amongst the vitamins, mushrooms do have a tendency to also concentrate other compounds. And so this is interesting. This is actually a Central American figure. And he is actually, you can see here, we've got representations of nicotine, again, considered to be hallucinogenic by some cultures, but also various kinds of mushrooms and other things. Realization that some of these mushrooms, again, not only might have been eaten, but might have provided medicinal or sacred ceremony functions as well. Another plant that we really don't see much in our diet today is the Jerusalem artichoke. This is actually the tuber root of a sunflower, again, completely indigenous to North America. The name is a little bit funny. It's Italian, a mispronunciation of an Italian word, girasole, which means turns with the sun. And so somebody was asking about the sunflower. Somebody said girasole. They said, did he say Jerusalem? And so they have been called Jerusalem artichokes, although they have no connection that we know of to the Holy Land. They are a very interesting tuber. They actually have a sugar in them, ilanin, which we do not encounter much in the rest of our diet anymore. And so I would caution people who are trying Jerusalem artichokes for the first time to parboil them, to cook them rather than eat them raw, and to try a little bit out before you go whole hog. Sometimes people have a problem with the digestion, but they really do have a wonderful nutty, sweet artichoke-like flavor. And so in this case, we have paired them with another indigenous plant. This case is one of the 5 or 6 types of cress we have in this area. Again, probably not going to find wild cress, except maybe at a farmer's market, but very similar flavor to the watercress that you can buy in the store, so a completely reasonable substitute. And so we have a nice watercress salad with a julienne of the Jerusalem artichokes, or the shunchokes. These are cooked in a little bit of acidified water to go ahead and soften and make them a little bit easier to chew. And then those are used as a garnish on the salad with raspberries and a nice raspberry vinaigrette. So again, a nice, light, and delicious salad using completely indigenous ingredients. And again, all sorts of good stuff going here in terms of your health benefits from the artichokes, the watercress, and the raspberries. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about, before we get into one of our last courses, we're going to talk about steatite. So again, these are fragments of 2 steatite bowls from a quarry that I surveyed up in the Pennsylvania-Maryland line. And you can see here, these are the lug handles. So this is the rim of the bowl. Here is the base of the bowl. And so these have been fractured. These are sort of quarter bowls that have been broken in manufacturing. But you can see these are actually quite deep. And steatite is a remarkable material. It's actually what's called a mafic material. So it's actually an igneous material from down in the mantle that has been forced up to the surface and has a lot of really remarkable characteristics. You may recognize it as it's being used to being made for lab sinks, because it's very chemically inert. It also is very heat resistant. It's used to make insulators. Melts at like 1350 Celsius, which is about 2000 degrees Fahrenheit, more than enough to be able to cook your soup. And also, because it has just an incredible thermal conductivity, this is actually a griddle made out of soapstone or steatite that is still made today. I've eaten pancakes cooked off of soapstone in Norway. And again, really good cooking surface. So it's quite reasonable that you would look at these characteristics and you could see that it would make a very useful cooking ingredient. Now, one of the issues is that we still haven't quite figured out how these bowls were being used. These were the first permanent cooking vessels, well, way before people started making pottery out of pots. And so at the time, if you wanted to cook something in a liquid, you could use a basket, you could carve something out of wood, you could use hide. I mean, you could make a hole in the ground and put a hide in it. And then you can take hot rocks out of a hearth and drop them in the liquid. That's going to raise the temperature. You do that again. And so you can actually cook in something that you could not put it on the fire using this hot rock cooking. And I have had people argue with me that they believe that these theatite bowls were a continuation of that same cooking technology. But I kind of wonder because, again, you cannot put these other vessels on fire. You can put theatite directly on the heat. It might fracture because of some imperfection in the material, but it's not going to melt. It's not going to burn. There's also been discussion that because of the time period that these things are being used, the transition between the archaic and the following woodland, it was a time period when there was a proliferation of oak and other kinds of nut trees in the environment. And maybe these things again are being used to process the nuts. Almost all acorns cannot be eaten directly because they have very high tannin levels. You have to process them, you have to soak them. And so people have argued, well, maybe these theatite vessels were being used to process the nuts, which again, I mean, it seems to me that these vessels, you're having to go to the limited locations where they're available, basically the front line of the Appalachian mountain chain from Maine down to Georgia, find the location, find high quality material, extract the mass, carve this thing out using stone tools. That's a lot of work. If you wanted to boil peanuts, I mean, boil acorns, you could dig a hole in the ground, put a deer hide in, fill it full of water, fill it full of acorns, and use hot rocks. Why are you going to Pennsylvania and getting this special vessel? And so, again, I think there's something else going on with siege-type vessels. There definitely can be used for cooking, but I think there's probably more. And again, maybe it's something we're just not thinking of. Again, we talked about those anadromous fish. One of the things about, especially the herring and other herring, I mean the shad and other herring, is they're really oily to the point where you actually cooking them, you have to control that oil. Well, fish oil is a thing. There are cultures in other parts of the world where they caught these really oily fish, would dry them and press the oil out. And that oil was actually saved and became a culinary cooking ingredient, became a trade item. It's called olechen oil, the olechen fish on the northwest coast. It is so oily that if you dry it out, it's called a candle fish. You can actually light it and it will burn. And so again, that oil was part of the culinary tradition and part of the processing of these massive amounts of fish that they had available. So again, we don't know. Maybe there was something like that going on here with the fish oil. And again, that oil started me thinking is that these theatite vessels, again, this is an intact vessel, are very different from all the other ways that you could cook at that time period. If you took a low-fired clay pot, which is all the prehistoric pottery was felt relatively low-fired, you put some oil in that, and you tried, again, hot rocks, you're never going to get it hot enough. Putting it on a fire, the oil is going to saturate the clay, it's going to burn, and then it's turned into a fireball. I mean, there was probably one thing that you couldn't do before the steatite came along, and so it's the beginning to look at this idea of maybe just a little tongue in cheek. You have these very well made medium depth vessels, extremely high heat, 2000 Fahrenheit. They are treasured and valued and very carefully curated. They're carefully formed as they're brought home into finer and finer and finer vessels. I wonder whether it might not be as simple as just fried food. I'm not sure that you could really fry something in any other kind of vessel that would have been available. You couldn't use the things that we know about. None of them would withstand the heat. And so only half joking, I always think, well, maybe that's what steatite was about. Not making French fries, but at least maybe making cornbread. And so in this case, we're going to come up with one of our last dishes here, which is a truly indigenous recipe for cornbread. Corn is the source of probably more proteins for the Native Americans and also for early America than any other process, but it has some problems. Is that outer husk on each of those kernels is basically indigestible. Everybody knows the jokes about knowing that you had corn, but you really have to do something about that. You have to grind it down physically into meal. You can soak it so that you use a lye solution to actually soften that outer husk. Or again, another opportunity you can do is you can actually, if you soak them and then dry them, you can fry them and make parched corn. And so this is a nice taste treat that I like to serve at some of my events. Pretty simple to make. And actually, you probably recognize the corn nut. And so plain corn nuts without any of the funky flavoring are also a very ancient kind of food that would have been eaten by peoples for thousands of years. A whole grain, nothing is taken away. Very often, this dark germ of the corn is removed in processing. And so in this case, parched corn is actually as a whole grain as you can get. And so that raises this question about how do we talk about cornbread? And most of the cornbread, if you even look at a Native American recipe cookbook, most of the recipes are again from that reservation period where they were using commodity materials that have been provided to them. And so very often, although there'll be corn in there, there may be some wheat flour, milk, yeast, all these are the kinds of things that would have not have been available indigenously, but were part of the economy of what was being provided to the reservation tribes. And so it took a long time for me to actually dig around until I found what seemed to be a fairly authentic cornbread recipe. And so this is one that is credited to the Chippewa. And so it's basically just cornmeal, a little bit of corn oil, honey, sea salt, enough water to bind things together, and then a mixture of whatever kind of berries or seeds you want. And so this is made into a nice, thick batter. And then you can cook it all sorts of different ways. You could wrap it in corn husks and steam them. You could wrap it in corn husks and put them in the ashes and make ash cakes. You could cook them on a flat rock with a little bit of bacon grease. Very often our events will go ahead and shallow fry them in a little bit of corn oil. One, because it's delicious, and two, also it's a really fast way to be able to cook something. If you're in a festival and have a couple hundred people waiting for something, being able to have something that only takes 10 minutes to cook comes pretty quickly. And so again, you can see this is more like what we think of as a hush puppy than the baked kind of cornbread that we talk about today. And that also raises another interesting question about another baked good, and that is the Native American fry bread. Um, Very often, if you talk about North American native foods, what is served at a powwow, the first thing that comes up is fry bread, and very often, served as a Navajo taco, where it's folded over with ground meat and taco seasonings, again, from the southwest part of the country. But it has a bit of a difficult legacy in the fact that, this was invented by native, the cooks in the Southwest on Navajo reservation. They had been basically taken off of their homelands, taken away from their hunting and gardens, and had been given wheat flour, which they had not seen before, and lard and salt and sugar. And this is what they had to eat. And so they came up with this idea of basically making a fried dough, which is what fried bread is. And so in some ways, it is a story about adaptation, and again taking something which was cast off and making it your own, and making it something which becomes emblematic for your culture. But again, it also has a complicated history in the fact that almost nothing in it is indigenous. Again, the wheat flour, the milk, the yeast, the baking soda, all of these things would not have been available indigenously. So although this may be traditional and it is something that people love and have nostalgia for, many native chefs, and again, I am not one, are reluctant to serve it just because of that complicated history. All right, we're going to get to dessert now. when they were handing out the fruits, North America got a complicated basket. Almost any fruit that you think about today that we eat in a common, day-to-day existence is probably, again, an import from Asia or from Europe or from South and Central America. In North America, we have the pawpaw, the persimmon, the crab apple, wild grape, wild cherry, beach plum, cranberry, and then, thank God, a bunch of different other kinds of berries. And this is a complicated, recipe list right here. The pawpaw, I'm not sure. We're actually lucky in this area that we can get them. So many people have actually tasted them. But again, they're inedible when they're unripe, and they are only ripe for a couple of days. And so it's like inedible, 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 ripe, rotten. And you have to catch them right at that time period and do something with them, which you can, because again, they can be processed and used for baking and made into preserves and all sorts of other things. The same thing with the persimmon, very, very short ripening window, almost inedible to the point of painful when unripe, and again, not very appetizing once they're, you want them a little bit past ripe, but once they're past ripe, they can go down pretty fast. And also, the persimmon that you get today from the grocery store is an Asian variety. The indigenous persimmons in North America are actually of an astringent variety, which are much trickier to use. Same thing with the crab apple. I mean, if they're completely ripe, you have a lot of sweetener, that would be great. But indigenous peoples really did not have that many indigenous sweeteners. I mean, again, we did have the honeybee. There is a native honeybee, but they were not as productive as the European bees that we know today. So honey would have been a rarer thing and a greater treat. You can tap maple trees and birch and honey locust and others and get that sap and make syrups. But again, a lot of work. So again, a sweetener just to sweeten a fruit would have probably been, something that would have been a lot of work to go through. And so again, crabapple maybe could be made into something, with a tart, like a vinegar or something like that. But the idea of it being able to be sweetened to be eaten directly is really tough. Again, we were very lucky in the fact that we do have all sorts of different kinds of berries. And so that is one of the things that would have been very important to indigenous people. But again, really short growing seasons in most cases. So it's something would have been really intensive, harvested, and then would have to have been processed. And so when it would be fresh, one of the things that they would make would be what's called wojap or the wojape, which is a cooked berry sauce. You could make it either with fresh berries or during the season, you could dry berries down. Very often, they would be cooked down and then spread out and dried into what is essentially like a fruit leather. And that could be then stored and could be reconstituted. So this could be made with dried or fresh. The traditional way is usually with choke cherries, which are from out in the Central Plains. We don't really have much in this area. So when I use it, I use whatever the best berries are that I can find. And very often I like to kind of mix them up because the combination of the different berry flavors gives you a profile that isn't sort of just like, it doesn't taste like a strawberry, it doesn't taste like a blueberry, it sort of tastes like a super berry. And again, what I do is I just cook these down, and then you can either be strained with the seeds taken out, or you can leave the seeds in, which would have been, again, more traditional. Depending on how sweet the fruit is, I'll use a little bit of maple or a little bit of honey, and maple syrup or honey to sweeten them. And then again, depending on the service, if you want it to be like a sauce, you can just cook it down until it's a little thickened. But very often I like to thicken it a little bit more and serve it as a dessert, essentially like a pudding or a mousse. In that case, I'll use a little bit of cornstarch to go ahead and give it that nice silky consistency. And so this is really, quite a delicious. It just tastes like the soul of the berry. And the interesting is a preservation and a preparation that you'll find other places where berries are harvested. I ate almost this exact same dish in Norway, where again they harvest the berries, sweeten with a little sugar, a little bit of cornstarch to make what's called rilguk, which is a delicious berry pudding that tastes exactly like this. And so here are the berries cooking down. And again, you can either strain or not as you see fit. Excellent source of vitamin C, obviously. All right, the next thing we're going to talk about is I've introduced you to Three Sisters. And although that is a part of the story, it is not all of the story. We know from many archaeological areas, including the Delmarva Peninsula, we find a lot less corn, squash, and beans than you would think as archaeological, would be the um, obvious if they were actually the major source of protein for the peoples, major vegetable proteins. We find a little bit, but not very much. But what we do find, again, are these seeds. Amaranth, a tiny little seed, but a very high protein level, what's called chemopodium or goosefoot, and then also sunflower seeds. These are very prevalent on a lot of the sites that we find throughout the Mid-Atlantic. And so I started thinking, again, I've already used the sunflower seeds. I'm not sure what to do with chemopodium, but I mentioned amaranth to a friend of mine from Mexico, and she said, "Oh, we make a candy out of that in Mexico that's called alegría." And so basically, they take these little amaranth seeds, you pop them like popcorn, and then they mix them with brown sugar and different kinds of seeds and nuts to make them into this confection. And so that gave me the idea that it seemed like we could go ahead and make a native version of this by basically just cooking down either honey or maple syrup to get it down to the point where it would crystallize into candy, mixing the ingredients, and came up with these amaranth seed treats, which are actually pretty delicious. These are actually made with pepitos or sunflower seeds and dried cranberries, again with the popped amaranth, and in this case, the crystallized maple candy. And so that is the dessert, and to go with it, we're going to have our final dish. In this case, we're going to talk about a nice herbal tea mixture that we often serve at these meals. Again, coffee, not an option. Black tea, not an option. But again, a whole forest full of different kinds of plants and seeds that you could use. And so I had a friend who ran an herb shop come up with this selection for me. So these are juniper berries, rose hips, red raspberry leaves, red clover, and peppermint. And so it's a very nice combination. The juniper berries have a really nice sweetness, sort of woodiness to them. And you've got a nice sort of acidic. The vitamin C in the rose hips is astounding. And it gives you a really nice sort of citrusy feel, nice kind of grassy flavor from the clove. Everybody loves mint. And then the raspberry leaves help to fill out the flavor. And so again, as we've talked, all of those flavors and all of those culinary uses would end up having ways that they would have helped the body as well. And so it's very nice that actually many of these seem to be connected with digestion and settling the stomach. And it's also fun when people take a sip of this tea. I think we're so primed to expect that caffeine sort of buzz from a hot liquid that people take a drink, and when that doesn't happen, you can sort of just see them relax. You can see their shoulders kind of, and it's just a wonderful, relaxing, caffeine-free, and very healthy beverage to finish off our meal. Okay, well, thank you so much for the opportunity to go ahead and talk. Hope I haven't run too long. And again, I do in pre-COVID times, do a number of events all over the Mid-Atlantic. Basically, people have asked me to do everything from medieval to Mayan to prehistoric, colonial, and I'm always fascinated to find new stories and new food. And so I hope that someday, as we get back out live, you'll actually be out at one of these events and I'll actually be able to share not just the recipes, but the actual food with you and go ahead and begin to get out there and let people taste some of the treats from the past and the stories they can tell us about the ways that people used to live. All right. Also want to let you know that in the COVID times where we could not do live events, I have done other virtual events like this, including a series of cooking videos for the Catoctin Furnace Historical Society. So if you enjoyed the talk today, there's some other stuff that you can go and see. We did 2 different sets of videos for the Iron Festival in 2 years, and then a holiday special for Christmas last year. And so with that, I will thank you all for your time and hope that someday we will meet over a table. And so open now for questions, recipes especially. And I'd also like to thank the Laurel Historical Society, my friends at the Lenape Tribe of Delaware, the folks up at Catoctin Furnace in Thurmont, and all the helpers and supporters along the way. And with that, I will close out the presentation and open it up to questions.
Yes, we're good again. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, good. Okay, I was echoing. Okay, so relating to the shad, the fish, did this occur with any other type of fish or just shad? The type of
I mean, shad, I think is most of the other smaller herrings that fall into this category were more commercially fished. The shad are big fish, and so I think that they became, one of the focuses for almost like this folk cooking. I mean, it's really interesting that everybody talks about like planking shad. I mean, even down in Virginia, there are like these. If you look it up, plank shad. It's an actual event, and so I'm not sure. I mean, I know in other parts. I mean, out on the the Northwest, obviously they do it with like salmon, the same sort of thing. Again, these large anadromous fish that are easy to catch at one time of period. But I'm not sure of anything else. And again, sturgeon, they're tough to like butcher, so I don't think they had the same kind of special category. But it's one of those things. It's like terrapin, like turtle and oysters, and that was that part of that tidewater culinary tradition. And because they were so specialized and so regional and so seasonal, they were special. I mean, you went to the restaurant to get turtle soup in the spring because it was just something you did in the spring.
And then there was another question. Did Native Americans use mulberries at all?
Yes, again, berries of any kind. I mean, unless it was poisonous, they probably used it for something. And so again, mulberry is indigenous, and so I'm sure we do find the seeds, and so we know that they were using mulberries, elderberries, raspberries, blueberries, all of those. And actually, the cranberry, we tend not to think of the cranberry. It's sort of like a northeastern thing, but the number one cranberry producer in the country, I think, is New Jersey. And so cranberries actually do come down into this area. And there's also something called the high bush cranberry, which is not a bog varietal, but that grows in the woodlands. And again, so that's something that they would have been using as well. But berries were a big thing. In fact, there's a fun story that, evidently the road to heaven is not, lined with good intentions. It's lined by berry bushes. And so the idea is the soul was going to heaven. It was going to be tempted to go off the path and get the berries because they were so delicious. And so it was one of these temptations that would keep you out of heaven.
I think that's great. Monica, I'm just going to jump in real quick. There was a comment from one of our Canadian viewers saying that the Native Americans make fry bread, but in Canada, they make bannock. Yep. So that's what you were saying earlier about the differences with the ingredients and that the true indigenous ingredients versus that contact.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because bannock is not an indigenous word. It actually seems to come from Scotland, and that's where and so we're thinking that it was probably like Scottish traders interacting with Ojibwa or something is how the name got into the indigenous language. Thank you, Maria.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think. I think there was a lot of comments, a lot of appreciation for the fascinating talk, a lot of questions on berries, but that's kind of to be expected. So I apologize if we did not get to your questions or we skipped over anything, but thank you so much for being with us tonight. And Henry, especially my thanks for this beautiful presentation and just so wonderfully researched and put together and just so appreciative of every aspect of it. Again,
well, thank you so much. And I appreciate, I mean, again, I do thank all the people that helped me, especially, again, this is not my culture, it's not my food. So especially the folks from Lenape and other tribal friends that have helped me, understand the food better and help me each day. And again, I hope someday, I've got a couple of live events that are beginning to get scheduled. And so hopefully one of these days we'll see you out there over a table and get a chance to taste everything.
Absolutely. I think that's a great note to end it on. So thank you, Henry. Thank you to Monica and Riley for helping us out tonight, and to everyone who was able to join us in person and on the recording as well. I will follow up with an email with recipes and contact information. And like Henry said, hopefully we'll see each other again soon over the table or at a demonstration, whether it's in Laurel or Savage or wherever Henry is cooking up some wonderful things. And again, hopefully this encouraged you to have a better understanding and appreciation for Native American foods and ingredients, and also Maryland archaeology. So I encourage you to learn more about our history from the ground down. So again, if there's any other questions, I'll be on for a few more minutes, but I'm going to stop the recording again with my thanks and appreciation. Thank you, everyone, and stay safe.
All right, hope to talk to y'all later.